Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first lecture of the season. My name is Bia Martin. Thanks so much for zooming in. Thanks to my guest, Andy HILTON, which I will introduce in detail very shortly. But first, could you all make sure you turn your cameras off and mic so it doesn't clash with the presentation and lecture, please. So tonight we are delighted to welcome Andy HILTON and his lecture titled Exhausted Artifacts, the Perpetual Quest for an Ethical Process of Becoming. Andy is a lifelong student of the discipline of architecture, constant and continuously immersed in beautiful objects, forms, textures, materials, styles, and spaces. He is fascinated by methods of production of such objects, particularly the how over the what. He states, and I quote, with the saturation of imagery on social media, our access to visual stimulation and inspiration has never been richer or more diverse. The arguable implication of this hyperstimulation is that we are now experiencing what Lars Lerp refers to as exasperated objects, or Piranesi's nightmarish vision of Camp Marzio, described by Manfredo Tafuri, as a crisis of objects, or a will to formlessness. In other words, our desperate clamor to produce consumable beauty is leading to a kind of bankruptcy of meaning, a fatigue of artifacts, a sickly, sweet overload of wedding cake. Without a legible process, a clarity of methods of production, such objects can become contextualist and attenuated, lacking integrity, criticality, and meaning. Like Edward Munch's Scream, stranded on the bridge of becoming, or Duchamp's Bachelors, we are left racked with anxiety, seduced by the desire for the unattainable, desperately searching for purpose and meaning. But what is really process? Why should it interest us? How do we shape and manipulate it? Why does it transcend objectivity yet temper subjectivity? And just to complicate matters further, to add a why to our broad how. Andy is an architect, urbanist, and academic. He co-founded the multidisciplinary practice choral studio and urban synthesis in Chengdu. He has over 25 years experience in both professional practice and teaching, and he has worked around the world, UK, China, Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Andy has taught at the Birmingham School of Architecture, at the Bartlett and Cardiff University, along with a number of institutions across China. Everyone, I am delighted to welcome Andy HILTON. Over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks, Bea. Did I actually write all of those things? That sounds pretty terrifying hearing it back. Okay, so thanks, Bea, for inviting me to kick off your ArchiZoom series. It really is an honor and a delight to present some of my work to you today. So I've got my fingers crossed that my Wi-Fi connection is equally excited and I don't spend half the evening asking if you can hear me like some sort of weird online seance. Okay, so as Bea said, I'm an architect, urban designer. I studied at BCU many years ago, and over the last decade or so, I've been predominantly working on projects in pretty remote parts of China. In 2008, I co-established Urban Synthesis, which is a multidisciplinary practice, now based in Chengdu. And then in 2015, I founded Choral Studio here in Birmingham. However, recently I also took a hiatus. I spent a couple of years as the deputy director of the M-Arch course at BCU, and now I'm back here in my bambooed man cave, working fully in practice once again. Okay, so as ever, I try and start all of my lectures with a bit of a warning. Firstly, that I use, if this is working, sorry, 1 second. There we go. I use pretty dodgy clip art. I, on occasion, use bad language, which I apologize for in advance. I do use Wikipedia, and I'm also prone to witter on about nonsense every now and again. And this is the point, really, that B gets a little bit nervous and worried about what I'm going to say next. So I'll try my best, B. Okay, so for most of my career, I've been fascinated by where stuff comes from, where ideas are from, and then how these ideas become actual, tangible stuff. This fascination dates back to my time as a student, and many of the ideas I was exploring at the time have formed the foundation of the methods that I still use today. So this evening, I'm going to go through that process a little bit and look into questions of how rather than what, and also discuss some of the challenges, reflections, and the lessons that have informed my everyday practice. Over the last couple of decades, I've worked on hundreds of projects. So it's been a bit of a challenge to select a couple to share with you today, but one of the challenges with working in China also is that for many reasons, only about 5% of the projects ever get built. So my intention with this lecture is to focus on design methodology rather than on the built objects. Okay, so one of the core principles that drives my design thinking is that architecture should not be project focused, but be process focused. We should not be driven by the endless production of artifacts, but by understanding what are the forces that shape our work in a longitudinal way, and through a continuous environment of learning, of knowledge, of discussion, reflection, of mistakes, and hopefully of successes. This is especially true during a time in education where the product of your labor is not constructed, but unconstructed space. So drawings and models, discussions and ideas. But for me, any questions of how must first be preceded by questions of why. So in order to do this, I need to begin over 20 years ago when I was where most of you are currently sat, although in those days we were mostly in lockdown because we were skint hungover or far too busy to lead any kind of meaningful social life. Okay, so as a young student, I was probably reading a little bit too much to Furi, who was painting a particularly bleak picture of architecture. As the introduction by B sort of suggested, this kind of created an exhausted, empty, alienated discipline. This is what Tafuri describes, constantly under pressure to produce newness and beauty and meaning and some form of social benefit, all the while becoming increasingly dislocated from the forces that shape the city. Tafuri describes this as the will to formlessness, or the crisis of objects, and he suggests that architecture as a discipline has become somewhat attenuated, and he likens this anxiety to the situation similar to Edward Munch's Scream. So Lars Lerup, another scholar of Tafuri, says that he was haunted by his fear of producing objects of pure form that in their baroque formfulness disguise the fact that they've got nothing to say. Now, this quote resonated with me quite a lot at the time. I wasn't really gifted as a designer, and like many young students, I struggled with subjective decision making. I wasn't trained in any kind of formal composition, and coming fresh from Stoke, I lacked any sense of style or taste. I was also probably too young to have constructed an archive of precedents or positive architectural experiences, and I didn't come from a family of architects. So like many, I relied on flashes or moments of inspiration to guide me, generally drawn from whatever nonsense had caught my eye that particular day. So such inspiration was invariably focused on the production of largely mediocre objects intended to fit specific briefs, which of course, as the next project began, were mostly forgotten and the process started again from scratch. The exhaustion and anxiety of this relentless demand was pretty unbearable, and it led, unsurprisingly, to me being unceremoniously booted off the course in the mid-90s. Well, that's another lecture. So Tafuri prophesied that our desperate clamber to produce consumable beauty is leading to a kind of bankruptcy of meaning, a fatigue of artifacts, which remain largely disconnected from the complexities and inequities of the metropolis. I guess my way of addressing this was through embracing and a close reading of process to try and move from a crisis of objects to what became, interestingly for me, a crisis of process. But first of all, before I get into the complexities of that, I want to start by looking at a bit of terminology. So I'm going to start with the word inspiration. So what is inspiration? Firstly, it comes from the Latin word, you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation, inspirare, which means to breathe into. And if we look at some of the definitions, what we see here is this idea of an inspiring or animating action or influence, such as you cannot write poetry without inspiration, or a result of an inspired activity, or a thing or person that inspires us. And the one that's more interesting for me is this idea of a theological definition, which is a divine influence directly and immediately exerted on the mind or the soul, or the divine quality of writings or words of a person so influenced. So it's this one I want to focus on a little bit, this idea of a divine influence directly and immediately exerted upon the soul. So what that tells me is that inspiration requires some kind of origin, something to breathe its essence into our work. And the irony of the current crisis of this is kind of interesting, I think. So let's have a look at this a little bit more. A divine influence directly and immediately exerted upon the mind or the soul. So this idea that in order to generate ideas and inspiration and work, you're waiting for some sort of bolt of lightning to push your ideas forwards. There's one problem with this though for me, and that's the fact that I'm a massive atheist, and I can't rely on this as a means of generating my work. So if we assume the absence of divinity, then the need to replace it with another external influence that will breathe its essence into our work becomes really important. And for me, that replacement is things like research, analysis, and diagrams and concepts and site observations, history. These are all considered examples of external influences. Okay, so now let's look at process. Another Latin term, processus, interestingly means to go forward. So I'll look at some of the explanations here. So the idea of a mechanical or a chemical operation on something in order to change it, or to convert a particular commodity into a marketable form by a series of steps. Or we also have a continuous action, this operation or series of changes taking place in a definite manner. So the process of decay being the example of that. So what we see here is this idea that we have a set of operations, a set of instructions, and we have a commodity. And that commodity goes through that set of instructions and it results in some sort of transformation occurring. So if we strip that away and then go back to what we had before, this idea of research, analysis, diagrams, and so on, if we reintroduce that to this format, then we can see how these elements start to form the basis of a process. We can mine this information and start to think about how do we apply these things together. That invariably led me to Eisenman and a few others, and I was fascinated by the idea of the diagram. And from Frank Lloyd Wright's use of grids to Eisenman's idea of something outside the traditional subjective reasoning, which drives your decision making and challenges your authorial assumptions or other inherent prejudices, I find completely enlightening. And Eisenman says that the diagram is a generative device. In a process of design, the diagram is also a form of representation. So we have these kind of two readings of the diagram. Firstly, what most of us understand as diagrams, which are plans and parti and bubble notations. And these are all representational devices or kind of means of communication. But what Eisenman and others are more interested in is this notion of generative diagrams, or a diagram that can manufacture newness or difference. And he goes on to say that the diagram can never be free of value or meaning, even when it attempts to express relationships of formation and their processes. Okay, so bear in mind that 25 years ago, parametric design was absolutely in its infancy. There was no mass dissemination of images through social media. high-end modeling software was way outside of the knowledge or affordability of students from Birmingham. And even Gary had to use aerospace software to develop his ideas. Greg Lynn, an ex-employee of Eisenman himself, was also turning to the car industry for inspiration and tooling. So that was a time you had to learn through action, through experimentation, and through repetition. And something that Eisenman was talking about, which I find fascinating, is this idea of the generative diagram. And now what he's saying is that architecture is not the product of a process, it's the process itself. It is the diagram. So I read and learned and experimented with notions of how space could contain meaning through the use of a device such as the diagram, where meaning was inherently coded or frozen into the DNA of architectural space itself, which also gave it a kind of resilience to the inevitable material and financial or other logistical changes. And I was interested in how meaning and narrative could be frozen into an interstitial state of becoming, how architecture and space could inhabit notions of time, and in Eisenman's words, how architecture can notate the forces of its own emergence. So we see in these two diagrams, these two examples, that you've got Bernard Tschumi trying to capture an event, capture a particular and freeze a moment in time, which is very similar to the Cubist ideas. This is Marcel Duchamp, where we see the figure and the space kind of merging together into this captured moment. So all of these things were influencing my reading as a student. This was an important precedent in my education. This is Eisenman's Guardiola House in Cadiz. For me, it signified quite clearly what process meant. So you have a commodity, which Eisenman used the EL form, which was to do with the fact that it was the minimal amount of surfaces you needed to make a sense of enclosure. So that was his commodity, and that was acted upon by a set of site instructions, which in this example was this idea of gravity, this idea of falling. So this results in a three-dimensional space that inherently contains notions of falling, and not just in the physical material, but in the spaces and the volumes. The foundations of what was to become an important part of my own design methodology were laid during this time. And the idea that the emphasis of the architect shifted from the author to the editor suddenly made the discipline feel much more adventurous again, and unshackled from, or to an extent, from the pressures of reality. It became much more associated with art and presence and meaning once more. And then suddenly everything became potential for this kind of process. I was also reading Sanford Quinter, who said that the site is ever pregnant with matter. So alongside this precedent, there's another famous quote came from Ian Pay's partner, Harry Cobb, who said that design is about satisfaction and architecture is about subversion. Now, there's a number of quotes that stick in your mind through your whole career. And for me, this is one that hasn't really gone away. This idea that design is about fulfilling a particular brief, but architecture is something else. Architecture it's about changing our understanding of something. So this was a super experimental period. And for maybe 4 years or so, I tried lots of variations with the diagram. This was one of the earliest ones, so going back quite a long time here. So this is like a two-dimensional, what we call the cold drawing of an industrial process. And by cold, I mean the drawing that is removed of unnecessary subjective content that was purely informational. This was a drawing of a pottery process, and it's made purely with orthogonal lines and pieces of text. And the interesting thing with this is the meaning of the text is represented in the aesthetic nature of the font. So there's bits where you can see it feels like it's pumped around the drawing. So the aesthetics and the meaning are getting quite close together. This also led to a lot more complex three-dimensional iterations. So exploring different kind of three-dimensional ideas, which I'll get into in a second. But the diagram for me was like having a partner. You could bounce ideas off it, you could question it, you could learn from it, you could explore it and challenge it, you could reveal secrets through it, and it could lead you down all kinds of rabbit holes. Okay, so this is another early attempt. to diagram in 3 dimensions. Here I'm trying to convey the way architectural value has changed from the facade to the floor plate. So the diagram tries to capture this idea of rotation. And although this project was pretty clumsy and extremely unrefined, it was the beginning of me consciously moving away from a simple plan extrusion, which was so common in student projects, towards a more sculptural understanding of space. And through that process, it sort of was creating this assemblage of artifacts. But in hindsight, I'm causing now all kinds of problems for myself. What I was actually creating was probably more solid than void, a kind of unbuildable collection of stuff. And it's important to remember that the diagram doesn't really have any understanding of scale or proportion or history or structure. And whilst this was exciting and a bit rebellious, it did raise important questions about who controls what, and what control do you as an architect or craftsperson have over the tools that you use. So I end up rather unsatisfactorily intervening into this diagram to cut floor plates through this huge lump of matter and carve volumes into it to try and make it feel like a piece of architecture. So that leads me on to the next project. And at this point, I'm learning from my mistakes. This is my thesis project. And for me, it was a pretty serious breakthrough moment. And it begins with a particularly geeky study of signal boxes, signaling systems, early communication systems, and breathtakingly beautiful track diagrams. My intention is to develop a process that leads the architecture to inhabit notions of permanence and belonging to a historic phantom of the site. I guess what's interesting is at this point, I'm not particularly interested in functional materiality or even maybe users to some extent, just in pure space and meaning, which was one of the freedoms that could be granted to us when we were a student. So I embark on a research process of how signals are passed between trains and tracks and how mechanical systems interface with communication systems through semaphore and Morse code. Lots of these little kind of thumbnail diagrams almost. Now, I could probably talk about this all night, but what it did is it led to this important diagram of amplification. Now, this is quite an old drawing, so it's quite difficult to read, but the idea is that it's about how this one lever could have multiple effects. So on the one hand, how it could move a signpost that changes meaning, or how it could pass an electrical signal all the way through to moving 2 tons of steel half a mile down a track. And this leads again now to this important diagram. So rather than, unlike the previous work, rather than the diagram being completely solid, this contained within it space, and I could explore that space in lots of different ways. So for example, I could start to look at scale and explore it as a kind of site arrangement. Again, I won't go into too much detail of this because I've got a lot of things to give you examples of, but this is sort of ultimately where that diagram led. Now, as loaded with potential as the diagram is, it's also a dangerous tool and needs to be carefully controlled. The diagram can easily lead you astray, and it was easy to become enslaved and seduced by it, or to trust it too much. And I guess the trick is to know how and when the diagram isn't working or isn't appropriate, knowing when to intervene and whether that intervention dilutes the integrity of our work. How do you control it? What do you hard and soft code into it, and what do you let it determine? And you need to let it find accidents rather than cause accidents. So processes and diagrams as creative tools are very powerful, especially at university. You don't produce buildings, you produce drawings. And in many ways, process is cleanest at uni. It's not muddied by the world or by politics, or any debate remains largely academic. But in reality, a plan is only any good until it meets the enemy. And from the moment you leave these virtual walls, your beautifully, painstakingly crafted process is under threat. The problem is we become precious, and especially by diagrams, we find it hard to break the rule systems that we create. But in my experience, you must break it, you must adapt it, you must learn to bend the diagram to your will, and you must subvert it. It was soon after this that Tafuri haunted me again. The realization was that I'd successfully encoded meaning into space, and I'd moved beyond this sort of artifact fetish, but I'd also fallen into the trap of becoming mildly obsessed with producing pure form to the detriment of all else, or the crisis of process, as I started to understand it as. So now this sets up the next 15 years of my career, trying to apply this abstract thinking in real projects, but more importantly, how to reconstruct an anthropomorphic subject. So in other words, where are the people in this work? So now I'm going to show you 3 projects that span 7 or 8 years of my career. I've chosen both landscape and architectural projects. They're all in China, and there's a couple of them which are under construction, one in which is being finished around about Christmas time, hopefully. So they've all informed this continual and ever evolving, but absolutely unfinished process. Okay, so I chose this project because it's sort of the opposite of what I've just been talking about. It's maybe what I call a soft diagram. So one thing I learned is that diagrams can be heavy, cumbersome, solid things, or they can be almost ephemeral, so much that you barely notice them. I guess that one of my later realizations was not just that diagrams can be implicit or explicit, but they can also have this alpha channel. You can dial them in and out as necessary. So not just as Eisenman discusses with this binary emphasis of solid and void relationships, but now there's this other phasing idea that you can bring in. This creates a much more like a sensual relationship. And for me, part of the maturity of practice comes from the understanding that this connection between the architect and the tools you use, whatever tools they may be, need to be that sort of sensual relationship. So this is Guilin. It's located in central China near Chongqing, huge city. It's a mountainous, remote region, and at the time of the project, there was no motorways, and the only access was by about a 9-hour drive along a winding mountain road. Whilst there was a thriving city on the other end of about 150,000 people, it was still a rural city, largely unconnected to the rest of the world, and made the most amazing noodles. Spent many years in Guilin, partly because it was one of the most humid places I've ever been to, which made the noodles particularly delicious. It was also the first place I saw a dog for sale in the meat market. Anyway, so our project was to design this 10-kilometer long river corridor that passed from deepest rural mountains through agricultural terraces, isolated villages, and into the old city core itself. And the project was intended to attract tourism and investment, but also to bind together this new urban core that was under development downstream. It was one of the most interesting surveys, I think, that we've ever undertaken. Huge team of people went over there to kind of trawl through every inch. So the river was essential to daily life. It was a source of water for cleaning, for bathing, for irrigating, for draining, for playing and socializing, and just generally being present with the environment. It was as beautiful as it was treacherous. And the city itself had developed around the river hundreds of years before. It was still very much a source of food of eels in particular, but had now largely converted into a kind of sewer. So our role was to reposition the river as this important actor back in the city. Okay, so we drew inspiration from 2 sources. There was a very famous ancient painting, which some of you may know, which is along the riverbank during the Qingming Festival, which is the Tomb Sweeping Festival, which I believe starts tomorrow. So this was originally painted 1,000 years ago, and it depicts riverside life during the festival time. And what's really interesting about it, it has this seamless transition from rural life all the way into urban life. The painting's, it's like 5 meters long by about 200 millimeters high, this huge sort of scroll-like drawing. Amazing. So we were really interested in that transition from the natural world through to this artificial world. And the second piece of inspiration was a piece of Chinese music called the Yellow River Piano Concerto. This was written during the China-Japan War in 1939. It was this rousing nationalist piece that celebrated the Yellow River, and particularly its beauty and its wrath. It was also a song that signifies great pride in China, and it was interestingly banned during the Cultural Revolution because it contained overly Western motifs. So when we started to explore these ideas, understanding differences in Western and Eastern music, things like the role of harmonies, of layered melodies, of scales, of different kinds of regular and irregular rhythms, this set of research became a series of soft diagrams or guidelines for engagement, or sort of signatures that we could dial into a little bit. And this sort of drawing just shows, my mouse has stopped working. Shows differences between the Western and the Eastern music structures. So within the concerto itself, there's these 4 movements, and we use that to start to map across the site, ultimately becoming this collection of both regular and irregular patterns, which we turned into a series of Weirs. So then I've got a whole bunch of diagrams now which kind of start to explore that. So we start off by analyzing the music, start to map beats and rhythms, apply them across the site, identifying certain presences of Western and Eastern influences, and they ultimately start to develop these different spatial characteristics. We're also looking at sections through the river and exploring this idea of different forms of harmony and how those harmonies become different spatial opportunities. So where each beat occurs, we just applied a series of harmonic diagrams that determine the characteristics of the weir, where there's any particular opportunities for interventions, and then we use this proportional analysis of riverbank sections. So the weirs, before doing this project, I knew nothing about weirs, but now I'm kind of fascinated in them. So what they do is they change the characteristics of a river. And what they allowed us to do is to change the speed of the river, but also to allow us to hear the river or to draw particular attention to aspects of it. So we're looking at the transition of this natural to artificial condition from the painting as well. And that starts to tell us how we can address things like riverbank details, how we can explore different forms of natural versus artificial engineering. So yeah, we go through this this sort of diagrammatic process, starting off with this layered sequence of diagrams associated with the Yellow River Concerto. The first one being this the rhythmic mapping, which becomes a sort of scaffold upon which we can locate other parts of the diagram. Then we have a melody section, which becomes pathways and routes. It's not working. Then harmonies, which they become positioning and proportioning of certain events, allow us to create places for listening and for viewing and engaging with the river. So this project was really interesting for me because I remember one particular meeting bringing in my guitar into the office in design meetings and trying to figure out parts of the design. So we were playing different sections and trying to work out how to do chord structures and things and what that meant design-wise. I've never used a guitar as a design tool in a meeting before. And I was working with this sort of great young landscape architect, Adam, who's had much involvement with the school as well. Okay, which leads to this kind of layered concept diagram. So alongside this diagramming, we're doing a bunch of other things. So one is we're understanding 4 forms of human engagement, and this is how we think about space and the relationship between people and the river. The fact that you can listen to music, or you can listen to the river, you can watch, you can play, or you can dance, and this is sort of sliding scale of engagement. And we found this as a really interesting tool to unlock parts of the river. So parts where you could view it, parts where you could hear it, parts where you could engage with it in different ways. And then we feed that into the diagram. So alongside that, we're doing more traditional stuff where we're trying to capture moments. We're trying to turn this analysis into much more subjective understanding about how some of these spaces are going to work. And then this is just a few of the visuals we produced for that project. So for example, the walkways, sometimes they're right on the river edge and other times they're much further back, allowing a more visual engagement as opposed to more aural engagement. And then the river, I'm only showing a few of these visuals, but the river becomes increasingly more artificial and we end up in this sort of city section. Okay, so that was, I guess, one of the first major landscape projects that we're involved with. It was really interesting to apply diagrams from an architectural field into a more landscape environment. Okay, so the next project is located in another remote mountainous location. I just seem to work in these kind of places all the time, really. But this was the northern edge of the Sichuan province, near a large city called Dazhou. Dazhou had a long history and was famous for developing alongside a mountain pass through which the northern armies poured during the period of the Three Kingdoms about 2,000 years ago. So this project had this amazing cultural history. It also had there was a project with multiple elements to it. So we had an urban design for a local town, there was a hotel development, and there was a wetland park. Now this example more focuses on the wetland park and the hotel because there was a sort of interesting discussion going on between those two parts of the project. So with its important cultural history, mountainous location, and the craftsmanship of the local people, we wanted to explore a diagram that embraced these notions. So we sort of converted that into ideas of time and explored this scalar notion of time through celestial time all the way through to human time. So this idea of millions and billions of years of formation right the way through to things like painting and dancing and how we form skills. And what was interesting with this was how the diagram for the hotel, which I'll talk about in a second, then generates the wetland park and how two projects kind of communicate with each other. So we begin with this study of the local architectural history, specifically around the relationship between the traditional hillside temple, the landmark tower, and the courtyard. These are the sort of intrinsic, repetitive architectural figures across Chinese and East Asian architectural history. This study examined how the relationship between these key elements changes through different dynastic periods. We went through a deconstructive process to understand the nature of these relationships and how they'd unfolded through history. And this began to inform a diagram that could maybe inhabit this sense of transformation. So this drawing here, we're looking at the way in which the tower changes from this vertical emphasis through to a more horizontal, more ornate emphasis. And then we're also interested in the way in which the tower and the courtyard, what relationship they have with each other. So what we see here is this transition from early ideas, which are centering of a tower on a sort of axis, and the way that then over time starts to change its positionality before ultimately the tower vanishes in place of a sort of sequential courtyard system. Now this is the hotel idea that grew from that. Again, what I'm more interested in here is not so much the design of the hotel, but the way in which now this starts to inform the landscape. So this is the view of the hotel, and you can read that transformation of vertical to horizontal emphasis a little bit, and maybe see some of the earlier work inspired in this in different ways. So the other thing that we're doing alongside this process is we're bringing in other cultural references. So this is an old Han Dynasty silk tapestry. And we're using that to explore how to set out color schemes for facades and how to sort of make references like that, really, or things like pottery to inspire color palettes or fenestration and those kinds of surface details. This is what's going on with that. So this one now is a rather rudimentary diagram which shows these towers that sit above these three courtyards. And it's that point that becomes a sort of launching point for the next phase of the project, the landscape part. So when we take these courtyards and then map them across this wetland site, roughly in line with what we were researching, something called the 7 Courtyard principles of Buddhism. I don't know why the 7, I can't remember. There was always this sort of central axis. Now, we'd established this axis as part of an earlier urban project. So we're making a kind of connection. Now, this is a sort of a small nod to one of Eisenman's projects, his Concerto project, and I'll let you guys do your homework on that one yourself to understand that. But what we see is the hotel kind of axis, and then this unfolding of courtyards. So with that in mind, this is the point where we introduce our next scale of time. So we're previously exploring cultural time, which happens over hundreds or thousands of years. But our new scale of time is celestial time, or space-time. And we're particularly interested in how mass bends time. So the higher the mass, the higher the gravitational force it produces. And in particular, how that gravitational force then distorts space. So time becomes an actual force that can shape space itself. So we explored this through the use of the grid. Now, the hotel, if I'm on my mouse goes to sleep occasionally. Okay, so the hotel kind of sets this grid out that we can then begin as our starting point. We can superimpose that across the wetland site to the south. And then what we did is we undertook this survey of the surrounding hills, and we calculated this hierarchy of topographical volumes. So there's lots of hills and mountains, and we kind of calculated the largest volumes. And what this gave us is a sort of a diagram of collective masses. And we then used the volumes of that to start to pull and distort this grid based upon the proportions of these different masses. So this is a little cartoon that we put together that talks about this process. So this is our wetland site. Then we have the hotel in the north, and the way in that sets up the courtyards. And then we convert the courtyards into a sort of basic grid system, and then start to apply these gravitational forces, which pulls and distorts our grid. So this is we're trying to come up with something that was a pretty cheap way of doing landscape design, actually. I mean, there's nothing overly complicated about the construction of this project at all. Very repetitive. There's just kind of a series of concrete rings and planters, and lots of sort of permeable surfaces. And we use the density of these grids to define where there is public space or where there is just permeable open land. And then this is some of the visuals that come from that project. So you can see the hotel in the background, and then this sort of celestial idea. The other thing that you can pick out in here is the certain motifs that we bring in to do with human time. So this idea of calligraphy, you might see the occasional like pen line or a brush stroke that sets out edges of certain important features. Oh, try and see if that works. There we go, it's working now. It's running a bit slowly. Yeah, so this sort of shows the way in which these two projects fold into each other a little bit. And another one here. I'm loving landscape at this point. I mean, landscape's now, I'm not formally trained in it, but it's a really important part of what we do in the practice now, essential really. And again, it's a relatively simple project, this one, but we try to make the diagram as, I guess, as repetitive and as straightforward and as deliverable as possible. Okay. So the final project that I want to introduce to you is a bit more recent. So this is one that was currently on site and hopefully due to be finished in January, or before January. We've moved further north again now. So this is near the city of Xi'an, and the site's located on this plateau which overlooks a small city called Baoji. Now, Baoji is one of the many cities that actually sit directly on the Silk Road. It's this largely agricultural city surrounded by miles of farmland, of ancient villages and cave systems, and just miles and miles of amazing, untamed, astonishing wilderness. There's been farmers and craftsmen and traders here for thousands of years, many of whom still live extremely traditional lives. And there's this whole other lecture that I give talking about the impact of the city on such lives. And again, ironically, the direct effects of that we're feeling now with the COVID crisis. COVID grew out of these kinds of places. But anyway, I digress a little bit on that. Okay, so we've been working with the city here for a few years, mostly on village redevelopments and social housing projects. But this was a really interesting opportunity to explore architecture a little bit more. Also, as a practice, it signaled for us the development of a more advanced technology. So things like VR, 3D printing, and other more advanced computational and communicational tools are now pretty common in the practice. So we have VR meetings inside our projects with our Chinese office on a regular basis now, which is amazing. So this project is it's for a new community center and an exhibition center for local crafts, plus a community landscape for socializing and dancing. As I'll talk about in a second, in most parts of China that we work, the external space is probably more valuable than the internal space in terms of people's daily lives, irrespective of the weather. So for centuries, the farmers of Baoji have used solar phases to determine their planting and harvesting sequences. There's 24 such solar phases, and in other words, this is the relationship between the earth and the sun and how it impacts on the daily life and the cultural practices of people. So if we modify this diagram to track the movement of the sun relative to the earth, this is the sort of kind of sinuous diagram that we end up being produced. And I particularly love the names of these things. And I'm probably going to dig these out for a project in the future at some point, like waking of insects or frost's descent. I don't know what these mean, but they sound pretty cool. So these solar phases, they're also really closely linked with the movement of the Plough constellation, which as I find out during this project, the Plough constellation, it rotates around the North Star setting out the latitude, I believe, from the Earth. So the position of the Plough then determines what season we're in. Now, it's the combination of these solar phases and the position of the Plough that determines planting sequences, harvesting festivals, and all these sorts of things certainly in this remote part of China, maybe many other places as well. Now, so a lot of the diagrams I'm going to show you aren't really drawn up to any presentation standard. These are really just screen grabs from the computer. It gives you an idea of the nature of work. We try and work pretty quickly, and we don't really have much time for this sort of the representation of process. So you'll have to bear with the clunkiness a little bit of this. But I kind of like the charm of that a little bit anyway. So the first stage is to look at a bit of the diagram, to understand it, to test it, to question it, and to see whether it infers a particular language that is useful to us. Does it seem like this diagram is going to produce any useful effects for us? So this is a beginning of trying to work out, okay, where's the space in this diagram? Because how are we going to make this work at all, really? So one of the first ways is we start to test how it responds to the site. Now, this is the sort of rectangular shape is the site. So the very most basic thing we do is we just apply it to the site, see what happens, and to see what kind of conversations it raises. So this is the site in a bit more detail. There was a few physical constraints. Whilst it was relatively flat, it had this amazing view to the south over the city. But there was kind of these weird constraints on there. So these two red boxes that you see, that we could only build actual buildings in those boxes. And secondly, on the left-hand side, I'll find my mouse again. Here on the left-hand side, this is like a weather testing center, a weather monitoring station. And now what this did is it imposed this 30-meter height restriction across our site. So we were very limited on how high we could go in this side of the site. So we had these quite rigid physical constraints that we could work with. And then this sort of mad, spiky diagram, and alarm bells were going a little bit about how, you know, was this the right diagram for this project, and whether we could, well, what would happen when we start to bring these things together. So the next step was start to test these constraints and examine what the diagram was trying to reveal. And this led to this idea that they're almost like two iterations of the plow. So this is what we're doing now, is instead of following the whole site, I've now pulled it into the two constraint areas. And I've kind of got this idea that this is almost like two versions of the plow as it rotates around the center of the site. And this center of the site, this point here, becoming this public space in which people could dance. So have this sort of slightly druidic idea about this central space, and then the square dancing, or this notion of performance of people rotating around this central point, which was, you know, this form of dancing in public spaces is massively popular in these kinds of communities. So what this would do is not just inscribe the notion of rotation into the architecture, but into the way that people use the space. That's what this is trying to set out a little bit. Now, alongside this process, I was also sketching these little themes and things we were trying to achieve to test against the diagram, to sort of set demands of what we were looking for with this particular diagram. So things like this idea of the importance of stargazing and the way in which those stars, how could they work for us? Could they become almost like a Bezier or NURBS points, which I'll talk about in a minute. Things like different buildings, two building types, and how they become these sort of iterations of the plow, and various other sort of ways of thinking about it. These just handful of many just ideas, really, all about how we could control the diagram. So how do we incorporate the notion of solar orbits and phase temperature variations? Led me to thinking about this idea of NURBS, or non-uniform rational B-splines. Again, something I knew bugger all about before we started this process. Or Bezier curves that had certain inbuilt parametric constraints, which meant I could maintain the parametric nature of the diagram and start to include some of these physical site constraints. Now, anybody that wants to go and find out about Bezier curves, they're super interesting anyway. So Bezier was a French engineer that worked for Renault, and this was the way in which they designed their cars, using these sort of fascinating curve, topological curve systems. They're not just graphical devices, but they're used as tools for controlling channel inputs, such as object velocities in software design. So the entire diagram becomes this set of three-dimensional interacting Bezier curves. So now I've jumped into another piece of software. This is just 3D Max, where we're starting to, so the various points in the diagram, we've turned that into representations of temperature changes across each solar phase. So we have this rise and fall that sweeps through the diagram. And that's how we're thinking about this Z-axis. And with the Bezier curve, it gives us some control over how we set points on that. So we can now start to manipulate the heights whilst maintaining this overall proportional relationship across the whole diagram. And these can be dialed into the Bezier equations and then parametrically adjusted afterwards to suit what we need. This is developing a little bit more. So I'm also starting to identify things like structural paths in this surface that would become maybe later beams and primary loading paths. So also, one of the tools we've recently got in the office, which is pretty common now, but is a 3D printer, which allows us to do prototyping. It also allows me to send files to the Chinese office where they print out things we're thinking about. We can have these these conversations across the two offices, makes it much more tactile. But what this allowed us to do was to start to think about proportions and scale, and make any adjustments to that that NURB idea that we were creating. Also, as ever, sketching is essential in what we do. There isn't a day goes by that we're not drawing something of varying degrees of interest. So in this project especially, sketching became super important as ideas bounced between a topological or mathematical modeling and then prototyping and then hand drawings. And we move between these different tools to sort of shape the project. So the diagram, we're not controlled by it. It's almost a partner in our process. This gives a sort of an idea of the way in which these things are all happening at the same time. So we're trying to work out how the plans are going to work, how the sections coming together, and again, it's informing the whole process as we go along. So whilst the diagram is certainly becoming spatially interesting at this point, it's also becoming completely unsuitable for our site. And what I mean by that is timber is really expensive locally. And the local tradesmen who for 50% of the year are farmers, and then the other 50% of the year are laborers and ground workers that really only know how to pour concrete. They lack the sort of complex skills and resources necessary to build things like timber grid shells. So we were going to look at some great examples of timber grid shells, but it was all completely pointless because we could never achieve anything like that in the sorts of places that we work. And this is something that, again, I used the word ethical in the title of the presentation, because these are things that sort of emerge as you meet the real world, and how to temper the diagram or how to maintain this sort of methodological process, but within a real environment where there's real issues. And this was an example of one of those things. So we then go back to the diagram, we re-look at it. We start to remove things like the double curvature. We start to explore much more appropriate materials for the site. So things like simplified spans, these large overhanging pan-tile roofs. Clay wall construction is something which is quite important locally. And the result was this still a diagrammatic, but a kind of tempered by both the site constraints and this cultural understanding. And then this also can be phased depending on certain capex. So these two buildings set in a way that they can build one and then unlock the site for the other part if necessary. So I'm going to just show you some of the visuals that come out of that project at different stages. These aren't final visuals. These are really just, we've got Twinmotion in the office, and they're just ways of helping us understand a little bit about what's going on. So what's kind of interesting about this project is that it has these huge eaves. Now, what we found by talking to local people there is how important this outdoor space is. So the principle is that they can occupy the outdoor edges of the building, still have some sort of protection from the elements, because it's one of the few places in China that does snow. At the same time, in summertime, it gets super hot. So the idea of shade and shelter becomes really important in that environment. So there's almost like 3 zones to the project. There's the actual internal space, there's this sort of transition zone underneath these long eaves, and then there's the landscape, which I'll show you in a second. Just going to flip through some of these. You can start to see I'll talk about that monolith thing in a second. And then there's also parts of the building which we've dropped right down that almost become landscape rather than building. Okay, so this is now bringing the landscape design in. So what we tried to do with this project is introduce a landscape which is really just a pure version of the diagram, and kind of freed from the other site constraints. And it was a way of us revealing much more clearly what we're trying to do. So one of the things, as I mentioned before, that idea of rotation, is we place this monolith in the center, and this is cut in a way so that you can sit in the central square and view through the holes in the monolith, and you can track exactly the North Star, which means you can then work out precisely where the plough constellation is. It's also this really important space for the community, like a community asset, really, so people can dance, they can look after children, that people can socialize and so on. This is how that's come together. And then there's this sort of viewing deck at the side, looks over the city. And this is probably the last couple of slides. So for me, this project, it starts to bridge the gap between Tafuri and Eisenman. Now, I haven't really thought too much about those guys for a very long time, and the process of putting this lecture together has been really interesting to reflect back on some of those questions. But I guess it starts to think about how to control the diagram. It reintroduces needs of the community, but it's still very much this sort of unfolding, ongoing, unfinished work in progress. And then this is taken 2 days ago. Yeah, so fingers crossed it turns out the way we would like. Okay, that's my last slide. Thank you very much. I'm happy to kind of take any questions or anything else you want to talk about, really. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Handy. Fantastic lecture. Thank you so much. I would like to open, the next 30 minutes for some questions. Well, I can kick it. I was making some notes as was going along that, you and I, we've talked quite often about diagrams and how diagramming is important in our work, in our way of thinking. So I think there's a question somewhere here where after I kind of put together, so thinking about if the diagram is a sort of kind of a sign system, right, that refers to a sort of the condition in architecture or of architecture. And after we distinguish that as a separate sort of kind of a simple equation of the geometry and function and the work of the diagram. So for you, so thinking about the geometry, the function that will be part of it. So where does the diagram become indexical, self-referential? At sort of what sort of point do you feel that the diagram becomes self-referential? And at the same time, after that or before that, the diagram also shifts from this sort of kind of a tendency of analogy to the concept and it becomes a possibility. I'm sorry, it's really rambled notes.
Okay.
I'll try to. I think it's basically the process of the diagram itself. So as we talk about the diagram, as a sort of a tool for our process, I'm actually trying to kind of invert and look at the diagram as the process of the diagram itself. That goes from the what it gives us, the geometry and the function itself, and we use it as an indexical tool that becomes a self-reference for our idea. and then it moves beyond that, beyond the analogy to a concept or an idea, and becomes a possibility. Try to work with that.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it is self-referential, but I think that's okay. I think that, I mean, I guess for me, the understanding really is that the diagram isn't a separate thing to the architecture. So you're trying to inlay particular meaning or particular ideas within the space itself. And I guess the big challenge for me was to say, well, at what point does the diagram stop helping me, or what point does it become kind of a useless tool where it's causing more problems than it's solving? I'm not sure whether this is answering the question, but for me, it's then it becomes about how, at what point are you prepared to reject what's coming out of it, and does that challenge the integrity of the project? And I guess for me, what I think I've tried to show is the things that you're inputting into the diagram in the first place. So when I was a student, it was very solid things like industrial processes, stuff that's really heavy and tangible. But more recently in practice is things which are less tangible. And it feels to me that gives you a little bit more flexibility with what you're trying to, you want the diagram to be a tool. You don't want the diagram to be some sort of master over the way that you work. And I think it's for me, I'm less concerned about the diagram. I'm more interested in my relationship with it and turning it into something that I'm not afraid of and I'm not overly worried about, and can pull it in and out as necessary. But at the same time, if it's not working, just throw it away and try a different sequence of things. So I sort of trust the process, but I don't necessarily trust the diagram all the time. And I guess that's what I was trying to do with the last project, where I was nervous to begin with about how do I make this spiky thing actually become something useful for the community? And, at what point, what's important in that? Is it, because obviously the community is more important than a spiky thing, but then it still reveals certain potentials and ideas and unlocks certain spaces and ways of thinking about that site which were outside of my thinking without the diagram. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yes. Yeah. We have quite a few students, year 3 students here. So it is important that they don't see the diagram as something that it's fixed. And fundamental. That's exactly what I wanted them to be aware of. Any questions from the group?
Can I ask one question?
Hi, Fabio.
Ciao, Bea. I was very interested about the project along the river. I'm sorry, I don't remember the title of that project. And I was curious to know if it is going to be developed in the final phase of building phase, let's say, because I found particularly interesting this relationship between the length of the river and the music. You call that a diagram. I am a great fan. I feel so much about music. I saw also on your T-shirt. I think it's the same for you. And I found particularly interesting this connection between Western culture about music and Eastern culture about music. So I really would like to know if it's going to be built that, and also what is your impression about the fact that maybe the sense of diagram, the meaning of diagram, can be applied much easier on a bigger scale, because everything is much more open to alternative solutions and alternative paths. I don't know if this is my impression. I don't use diagrams in general, but I have always had this kind of impression that the diagram on a bigger scale is much more helpful, or at least it might be much more helpful.
Thanks, Fabio, for your question. I'll take them one piece at a time. So in terms of the construction of that project, it was actually started and relatively developed, but as I inferred at the beginning of the presentation, there are many factors with working in China, and if anybody's worked there, I think they'll probably understand that there's so many political factors and complexities that even projects that begin might not necessarily get finished. You know, the political system is such that the leaders, and we predominantly work for cities rather than developers, but every 4 years the city leaders move somewhere else, and if a project isn't completed within that time, quite often the new leader will come in and just sort of etch a sketch the whole lot. And that's sort of what happened with this project to some extent, which was a bit frustrating because ironically it was one of the most constructively developed projects that we'd worked on. We were working with civil engineers on developing riverbank sections, on working out all sorts of these amazing ideas of natural riverbank systems. We were looking at flood levels, and we got a hugely developed set of documentation for that project, which because it was ongoing, but sadly it didn't finish. Moving on to the question about music. I mean, I'm obviously a huge music fan, but what I love is this idea that it can be multiple things. So it can be this sort of poetic, kind of beautiful, emotional, inspirational influence, or it can be this incredibly geeky, mathematical, scientific study. And I really enjoyed that working with Adam in particular on this project, where we were exploring both of these notions. So on the one hand, we've got this really rigorous structure of, okay, what's a harmony? What's the difference between Western and Eastern ratios? How do we represent rhythm in different ways? So we'd got all that sort of super geekiness going on. And as I said, I brought my guitar in so that we could work out spacings between notes, all these kinds of things. But then at the same time, we were really interested in more the emotional side as well. So how do we make a connection between the landscape and music? You know, how do we bring sound into the experience of the landscape? And these aren't really diagrammed things. These are more softer, more subjective influences. And I really enjoy the freedom of drifting in and out. That idea I was talking about, the alpha channel of the diagram, is what I mean by that is that you sort of turn up the opacity as you need it, or you can dial it back and then start to bring in these other kinds of important influences. So I think, you know, that I think I'll be doing many more projects that explore musical theory or musical experiences in different ways. So the last part, the scale question, is it more applicable to larger scale? I don't know whether more applicable is the right way. Certainly my practice has evolved to address larger scale. So I do mostly urban work, mostly landscape work now, but the methodology is kind of the same. I think that you are certainly freer to explore your ideas at that scale. And I think that it's a little bit more unforgiving when you're working at those scales because it's a bit more abstract, I suppose. But then again, the last project I showed, that the Baoji project, I really enjoyed getting back into the nitty-gritty of architecture again and the challenges of working at that particular scale. So I absolutely love working at the larger scales. I think it's incredibly enlightening and revealing, but at the same time, I don't think that discounts it as being a very useful tool for architecture as well. And even smaller, to be honest. I mean, I've seen some really great jewelry design recently using diagrams, which was fabulous.
Thank you. Just one last note on the side, that project in particular, I mean, I found very interesting the whole presentation, but that project in particular made me think about that beautiful book of Bruce Chatwin, The Song Lines, about the structure of geography in Australia. And it's a very interesting, I found a very interesting relationship with that beautiful book, just that.
Yeah. I don't know that book, but sounds interesting. Thanks, Fabio.
Thank you, Fabio. Any more questions?
Sorry, there are some questions I found on the chat.
Oh, we have
side.
chat. Yeah, let me just.
Okay. How do I open that? Why shall I stop sharing my screen for a minute? There we go.
Yes. So can you access? Yeah, can you access it?
Yeah,
I think we have one from Rebecca saying, "Do you feel like you have more creative freedom in China than in the UK?"
Yes. Kind of simple answer, really. I mean, I worked for a decade, maybe more, in the UK, and I did do some diagrammatic projects, and I have worked on some fabulous things with different practices over the years. But maybe it's a combination of having your own practice or working in China, but certainly working in China has been enlightening for many reasons. Again, I don't know whether it's working in China itself or whether the types of clients we have are all local authority or predominantly local authority clients, and the political system of there is such that you do have a lot of freedom in what you do. Having said that, the timescales involved are a quarter of what they are over here. So whilst there is the freedom, the speed with which you've got to turn the thinking around is pretty terrifying sometimes. So quite often, and hence why, I showed a lot of the drawings in the way I did. These are not finished drawings in sense of, they're not prepared for lectures. This is just stuff I've grabbed off my computer screen, just because that's, as soon as we finish one project within, a couple of weeks or so, we're on to the next one again. And so it does come with huge challenges, but there is a sort of there's an excitedness about being part of that environment. I also love working in the places that we work. A lot of them are very remote. We get to work on some incredible, meaningful projects. Things like massive social housing projects or community work and all those kinds of things, which bring meaning to any architect's existence, really. So yeah, I love working in China. It's amazing.
Andrew.
Hello. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Andy.
I have a question. There's this notion and idea of the architect's role as a craftsman and a builder becoming now somewhat separate. And we make a lot more use of resources and specialists to help solve problems. And I feel that's very applicable to you being so remote from your sites that you work from, in very remote and difficult locations, as well as have material constraints, like when you spoke about the most recent project, the N. So where do the roles of architect and designer and engineer fall when you're met with these kinds of constraints and in instances where new approaches have to be implemented, like
okay,
the bridge shell?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's different things in there to unpack a little bit. Firstly, whilst we do work with other disciplines quite extensively, in fact, my office in China it's got not just architects, but it's got interior, it's got a landscape, and it's got planners. So within the practice, we have multidisciplinary specialists anyway. And we also work quite closely with things like structural engineers, civil engineers, environmental specialists, because we do a lot of kind of riverbank work and things like that. So those are still there very much so, but obviously they're all in China, and we can't necessarily have meetings in the same way that we would here. So there is a remoteness that comes with that process, and that does change your work. So the way that we make it work here is we generally put a sort of broad concept idea together in the UK, and then it goes over to China, and then things start to move backwards and forwards, rather than it being a bit more of a symbiotic process where if everybody was based in the UK. So those guys still exist. In terms of the craftsmanship, yeah, absolutely, that's changed a lot. You know, I went from spending years working as a project architect in the UK, trawling through materials on site with contractors, trying to resolve details of flash-ins and God knows what else. And that doesn't exist anymore. That's kind of gone from my daily life, absolutely. And also, in almost all of our projects, we have these challenges where what we would love to see is one thing, but in reality,
Oh no, Andy's frozen.
else. And I guess for me, being interested in form and space, it kind of it marries nicely with me needing to not worry too much about, you know, material deliveries. But also it raises some really interesting questions, like the Guilin project. You know, there was no motorway, so we couldn't bring anything like steel work or any prefab work in, nothing like that at all. Everything had to be delivered in small vehicles. So that affects the decisions you make about the design. And that's, you know, it's kind of cool, actually. Does that answer your question, Andy?
That does answer my question. Unfortunately, you did cut out for like a good 10 seconds there for me,
Right.
so I may have missed a little bit of what you said.
Apologies.
But that last bit capped it off pretty well, so thank you very much. Would you say that the reliance on the diagram, because you have such this remote relationship between where you are and the people that you work with, is so much more important to communicate what you're trying to achieve?
It depends who you're communicating to. So the conversation that we've had today isn't necessarily the same conversation you would have with a client, but it is absolutely the conversations you would have inside the office with the people that are working live on it. So we almost have different types of presentation. So you sort of have the client facing ones, which talk about different things and don't really get into the complexities of process. And at the same time, you know, we will have super detailed conversations about, like the example we gave about bringing the guitar in the office and trying to work out how we turn you know, thirds and fifths into surfaces. And so I guess that, you know, communication is always critical, but the nature of that communication changes depending on what you're trying to get out of it, really. And what I'm really loving, as I said before now, is we have this VR thing, which is super geeky for me. And I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, actually inside the model with the Chinese office, and we're drawing on it and we're walking around it and we're trying to understand scale and proportion and these sort of, you know, critical things, really. And that was amazing. I mean, that was just game changing for us. And also things like the idea that we can send an STL file and then have a conversation with looking at the same model is huge.
Yeah, that sounds really incredible. Thank you so much, Andy.
Brilliant. Any more questions?
Just me and you left, B.
I think so. Well, nothing on the chat, so I think we're wrapping up then. Andy, awesome as usual. Thanks so much for taking the time and joining ArchiZoom and and talking about your work and your passion. Thank you very much. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of the series, and good luck to the students with this sort of crazy year ahead. I think these challenges are you can work them in positive ways, so I'll be fascinated to see what happens.
Well, thanks very much. I hope to see you around.
No, well, you might not recognize me with all the masks on.
You're mask or no mask. Okay, keep safe, everyone. Again, Andy, thank you so much. And just keep up with the good work. And we'll keep watching.
Brilliant.
Thanks,
guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.